If you're a parent, you hopefully love your children. But what if you were a medieval parent, and the child mortality rate looked a little less like this, and a little more like this? In 1960, the French historian Philippe Ariès wrote a book called Centuries of Childhood, in which he argued the controversial idea that, in medieval society, the idea of childhood did not exist. In addition to his central argument, he added that the general feeling was, and for a long time remained, that one had several children in order to keep just a few. People could not allow themselves to become too attached to something that was regarded as a probable loss. Ariès illustrated this mindset with a variety of evidence, including the lack of pre-16th century funeral effigies for children in the Garnier's collection, a number of anecdotal quotes, including one from the 16th century Michel de Montaigne, who said, "I have lost 2 or 3 children in their infancy, not without regret, but without great sorrow," and the tendency to bury children that had died without baptism in the house, on the threshold, or in the garden, much as one might a household pet. Now, Philippe Ariès' work is still an important, indeed the founding text on the history of childhood, and historians continue to debate about his assertion that there was no concept of childhood in the medieval era. However, on the question of whether pre-modern parents loved their children, the answer is overwhelmingly that they did, and even Ariès himself seems to have realised this near the end of his book, stating that, "This is not to suggest that children were neglected, forsaken, or despised. The idea of childhood is not to be confused with affection for children." But as this myth is so prevalent, it's worth looking at the evidence that has shown us that it is not true. And I should warn you here that because the places where it's easiest to discover how much pre-modern parents cared about their children are the places where those parents are most likely to have displayed those emotions in a magnified way, some of this evidence is quite morbid, including our first piece of evidence, which takes us all the way back to ancient Rome. In the Roman world, household slaves were considered part of the domus, making them an extension of the family, and if they were manumitted, set free, they would generally be legally adopted. In one case, a slave girl called Erotion died at the age of 5, and her owner, a poet known as Martial, had a tombstone commissioned for her. He had her buried between her parents who had died before her, which would not in itself have been cheap. Obviously, the fact that Erotion was kept as a slave rather than being freed is enough to make us question how much Martial could really have cared about her, but the epitaph he wrote suggests some genuine fondness. "Here I commend to you Fronto and Flaccilla, your daughter, my joy and my delight. Let young Erotion not be terrified by the black shades and the gaping mouth of the Tartarian dog. She would have completed 6 cold winters, had she only lived but 6 more days. Let her play happily between her aged parents, and chatter my name with her lisping voice. Let the turf covering her bones be soft and not hard, and do not weigh heavily on that girl, Mother Earth, for she was not heavy on you." Okay, but there's an elephant in this room that's too large to go unaddressed. What about child exposure, the practice of leaving newborns outside the city walls to die? How could a group of people who love their children accept such a practice so willingly? Well, this takes some looking at. Firstly, it should be understood that exposure wasn't always about ensuring the child would die. In some instances, a child was left in a popular exposure spot, where the parents knew that someone wanting a child may well find them and adopt them, giving the child a chance to survive. Some children were even left with tokens that could later identify them as having belonged to that family, so they might reconnect later in life. This showed a clear desire for that child to live. But this wasn't always the case. Sometimes a child really was left outside the walls, in some obscure spot where death would be all but guaranteed. To understand this better, we have to look at the reasons that exposure happened. The reason you're probably most aware of is deformity or disability. In the modern day, children born with birth defects have a much better chance of surviving and having a fulfilling life. In ancient Rome, however, bringing up a child with a major disability could be nearly impossible, and the child may well suffer and die anyway. It is perhaps easiest to understand how ancient Romans could care about their newborn and still think that by leaving them to die they were doing the right thing. Some children were exposed for economic reasons. A poor family may simply be unable to provide for an additional child, and rather than attempt to feed them and cause their other children to starve, it was better to expose them and hope that some other family might ensure their survival. Very rarely, children would be exposed due to evil omens. This was, as I mentioned, very rare, but it was recorded to happen. There were a number of children recorded as having been exposed directly as a result of being born around the death of Emperor Germanicus in 19 AD. This is more difficult for us to understand, but you don't need to look far in history to see people doing things they don't necessarily want to do for the sake of their faith. Girls were sometimes exposed for the simple crime of not being boys. Female children were often less valuable to ancient societies than male children, and this is a trend which unfortunately continues in the world today. We don't know how common this was, but it is recorded in a play by the Roman playwright Terence, and there are letters sent to women by their husbands telling them not to rear the child if it is a girl. Finally, children might be exposed if they are illegitimate. We know that Claudius ordered the exposure of a child his wife had had with a free slave, and ensured the child had the minimum possible chance of surviving its exposure. Augustus is reported to have forbidden the rearing of an illegitimate child born to his granddaughter, Julia, and children born of incest may well also have been exposed. The exposure of newborns by a man who wasn't their own father is hardly evidence of parents not caring for their own children, however. So, we can see how the acceptance of the practice of exposure in ancient societies doesn't necessarily indicate that the people living in those societies did not love their children. And this is especially the case when we have ancient sources like the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius from around 170 AD, which explicitly state that losing a child is a self-evidently painful experience. Aurelius, listing what he has learned from various people, attributes the following lesson to Apollonius: independence and unvarying reliability, and to pay attention to nothing, no matter how fleetingly, except the logos, and to be the same in all circumstances, intense pain, the loss of a child, chronic illness, and to see clearly from his example that a man can show both strength and flexibility. Now, let's move forwards to medieval Europe. In 1348, King Edward III of England sent his 14-year-old daughter Joan to Spain, where she was to marry Peter of Castile, the son of Alfonso XI of Castile. Her father paid vast amounts to ensure she was properly protected on her journey, and to make sure that when she arrived in Castile, she would carry with her a display of his wealth and power. Unfortunately, when she arrived in France, so had the plague, and she soon became one of the first English victims of the Black Death. The king was devastated, and he made sure his pain was conveyed in the letter he sent to King Alfonso. "We are sure that your magnificence knows how, after much complicated negotiation about the intended marriage of the renowned Prince Pedro, your eldest son, and our most beloved daughter Joan, which was designed to nurture perpetual peace and create an indissoluble union between our royal houses, we sent our said daughter to Bordeaux, en route for your territories in Spain. But see with what intense bitterness of heart we have to tell you this. Destructive death, who seizes young and old alike, sparing no one and reducing rich and poor to the same level, has lamentably snatched from both of us our dearest daughter, whom we love best of all as her virtues demanded. No fellow human being could be surprised if we were inwardly desolated by the sting of this bitter grief, for we are humans too. But we have placed our trust in God and our life between his hands, where he has held it closely through many great dangers. We give thanks to him that one of our own family, free of all stain, whom we have loved with our life, has been sent ahead to heaven to reign among the choirs of virgins, where she can gladly intercede for our offences before God himself." King Edward made his feelings about his daughter's death very clear, but it wasn't just medieval kings whose feelings and grief for their children is clear. The Bedfordshire coroner's roll records that a 10-year-old boy who was shooting at a dunghill with his bow and arrow missed his target and hit a 5-year-old girl instead. The jurors said that it was an accident, but that the boy had fled because he was afraid of the father's anger. This is not the reaction one might expect from a people who supposedly did not love their children. Also recorded was the following. On Friday last, August the 9th, 1298, John Chevalier and Alice his wife were in a shop where they abode in the parish of St. Mary's late at night, ready to go to bed, and the said Alice fixed a lighted candle on the wall by the straw which lay in the said shop, so that the flame of the candle reached the straw before it was discovered, and immediately the fire spread throughout the shop, so that the said John and Alice scarce escaped without, forgetting that they were leaving their child behind them. And immediately when the said Alice remembered her son was in the fire within, she leapt back into the shop to seek him, and immediately when she entered she was overcome by the greatness of the fire and choked. I think we can agree that throwing yourself into a fire in an attempt to save your child is an act of love. So, we've looked at the responses of some parents to the deaths of their children, and this tells us something about the love those parents had for their children. But deaths are rather extreme situations, so what about the everyday? Did parents acknowledge and enjoy meeting the emotional needs of their children? The answer is yes. Yes, they did. Take this medieval lament from the perspective of Saint Mary, the mother of Jesus, who complains that whilst other women can enjoy time with their children, hers is dead. Of all women that ever were born, that bear children, abide and see, how my son lieth me furore, upon my knee, ta'en from a tree. Your children you dance upon your knee, with laughing, kissing, and merry cheer. O woman, woman, well is with thee, the child's cap thou puttest on, thou combest his hair, his colour see. Dancing them on their knee, laughing, kissing them, and combing their hair. These are all affectionate things we might expect a mother who loves her child to do, and it was clearly the sort of thing that medieval people expected mothers to do as well. But what about fathers? In Leon Battista Alberti's 15th century dialogue, Il Libro della Famiglia, one of the speakers, named Alevado, makes the expectations of a father's paternal love for his children clear. Who would believe, except by the experience of his own feelings, how great and intense is the love of a father towards his children? I am sure that no love is more unshakable, more constant, more complete, or more vast than the love for which a father bears to his children. Bartholomeus Anglicus agrees in his 12th century De Proprietatibus Rerum that a father loveth kindly his child, insomuch that he spareth his own meat to feed his children. He also expresses the primacy of the role a father has in educating their children. A man loveth his child, and feedeth and nourisheth it, and setteth it at his own board when it is weaned, and teacheth him in the youth with speech and words, and setteth him and putteth him to learn under ward and keeping of wardens and tutors. Indeed, children from the age of 7 were largely understood to have reached an age where it was appropriate to begin schooling, and fathers often began teaching their sons either by themselves or by providing tutors for them around this age, or potentially even a year or two before, whilst girls would begin seriously learning the duties of a wife from their mother at that age. But how else was a father supposed to show their love? Bartholomeus gives us more on that. The more the father loveth his child, the more busily he teacheth and chastiseth him, and holdeth him the more straight under chastising and law. And when the child is most loved of the father, it seemeth that he loveth him not, for he beateth and grieveth him oft, lest he draw to evil manners and tatches. Bartholomeus is not the only medieval writer to put forward the importance of fathers beating their children, and it is perfectly true that the maxim that sparing the rod would spoil the child rang popular in medieval society and was practiced often by both parents. But in reality, the truth of displays of paternal love were not so brutal as medieval texts such as Bartholomeus' suggest, although it does seem generally true that women were expected to be the parent mainly responsible for looking after the child's emotional needs. In one 15th century ballad, a husband and wife, both believing that the other one had it easier, swap places with the husband playing the role of the wife and the wife playing the role of the husband. One of the things the man was expected to do in his new role as the wife and therefore mother was, "Keep well our children, and let them not weep," suggesting that generally looking after young children and comforting them when they cry was primarily expected of the mother, not the father. That being said, we do have evidence that fathers took on a more nurturing role in the Middle Ages. In the early medieval era, Saint Joseph, the stepfather of Jesus, was a largely ignored figure, being sidelined by the much more famous Saint Mary and Jesus. Increasing focus on the humanity of Jesus led to more focus on Joseph during the period from around 1000 to 1500 AD, and this in turn led to worries that because Mary and Joseph did not have offspring, their marriage was invalid. This concern was solved by the 13th century Dominican friar Albertus Magnus, who argued that Joseph had named Jesus and cared for him, which made him a true father, and thus validated his marriage to Mary. This led to medieval artwork that emphasized Joseph's role as caring for Jesus in order to validate his claim as being a true father to him. Joseph is depicted warming the baby Jesus' swaddling clothes by the fire, cooking Jesus' food, bathing him, changing his nappies, and even cutting his own clothes in order to make swaddling clothes for Jesus. Whilst this did occasionally lead to Saint Joseph being considered unmasculine, and sometimes his situation was ridiculed by medieval audiences, there was also a sense of approval of his nurturing actions towards baby Jesus. For example, in a sermon from the 12th century abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, Joseph is exalted over many kings and prophets because he was able to carry Christ, to take him by the hand, to hug and kiss him, to feed him and keep him safe. Joseph, with his nurturing of the baby Jesus, was a model of fatherhood for late medieval Christians. But just like the model of showing love through constant beatings, the reality was more complicated. The historian Shulamith Shahar gives us a more rounded and practical picture of fatherhood in medieval Europe. In reality, the intensity of the bond with the father in the first years of life apparently varied from class to class. In noble and in prosperous urban families, fathers were often absent from home for lengthy periods. In the urban labouring class and amongst peasants, fathers were more rarely away from home, and the possibility of establishing a bond with a small child existed, at least theoretically. But, as has been the case in all societies known to us, so also in the Middle Ages in all strata of society, it was the mother who nurtured the small child, or, in the upper classes, the wet nurse and nurse. The women who taught children to speak also transmitted the oral traditions through songs and tales, and taught them their first prayers. It was they who created the child's first world picture. By means of the songs and tales of wet nurses, the popular culture was also transmitted to the children of the nobility. Notwithstanding, one finds in literature mentions of paternal love, devotion, and readiness for sacrifice on behalf of his children under extraordinary circumstances, and also descriptions in other sources of interest and involvement in the raising and education of the small child, even in Italian towns. Giovanni Morelli, eulogizing his deceased 10-year-old son, describes how he followed the raising and development, what satisfaction he felt on hearing his first words, and how much happiness the child's love brought him. In the life of Saint Abert, it is related that the child wanted to observe all the fast days, but that his father feared for his health and prevented him from so doing. After the miracle in the church, Ambrose of Siena was sent back to his parents' home. According to his biographer, as a small child, before learning to read, he had been in the habit of leafing through his mother's missal. His father, who noticed this, ordered 2 books especially for him. Even if these anecdotes are only the fruit of the author's imagination, they indicate that paternal interest and participation in the raising of children was acceptable to readers, and hence was not extraordinary. As noted, there were fathers who first taught their sons to read. So, it's clear that medieval parents loved their children, even if the ways that medieval parents showed their love differed from the ways we might show it today. And just like today, the way that a mother was expected to express her love for her children differed from the way a father was generally expected to express his love. But as was pointed out by King Edward III, medieval parents were human too. Despite much higher infant mortality rates, they could not simply turn off their love for their children. However, they used their belief in heaven and fell back on social networks in which many would have shared their experiences to cope with their pain, just as many do today. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe for future content. And a big thank you to my first $10 patron, and if you would like to support the channel further and see videos earlier, check out my Patreon in the description of the video below. I'll see you next time.